Welcome to the Alternative Online, a ministry of the Alternative Family Church. Thank you for joining us.
Well, good night, Alternative Family and our extended family who view us on our online channel of YouTube and Facebook. We want to welcome you to our next time of Bible study, and where we spend time to dig into the Word of the Lord. For our Bible study tonight, I want to continue our theme on being the church in time of crisis. Being the church in time of crisis. Last week, we were talking about being the church in time of crisis on the subject of prayer, meaning that the church in time of crisis needs to take prayer to a next level. We cannot become lackadaisical, and we need to become very take our prayer to a next level. It's like what Spurgeon said, the man of God cannot be lackadaisical. He or she has to be on fire, on point, praying that God will move on the behalf of His people and the ministry that they are having. So I want to invite you to let's start our study tonight. Tonight we are going to look at a familiar passage, and we are looking at our next P. Last week was the P of prayer. This week is going to be the P of provider. We're going to see and understand our God as a provider through a period and a time of crisis. As we be the church, we are going to look at the life of Jesus and see what we can learn from Jesus and about God as our provider. More so about God as our provider, more than what we can do to provide in time of crisis, because we know that we need to provide in time of crisis. But let's see our God as provider in times of crisis and what He does in times of crisis. So we are going to the Gospel of John chapter 6. We are locating ourselves in John chapter 6. We are looking at verse 1 through the verse 15. Over the years, there have been various views or various analysis or observation in respect to how we can interpret and understand the Gospel of John. There have been various views. There have not been only one or two views. But over the period of time, two views have actually stuck with me and really caught my attention when I try to understand the Gospel of John. The first view is centered around the argument that John was writing as a way of indictment against the Jewish and religious leaders that were attempting to downplay the divine nature of Jesus. That Jesus Christ was simply a man. He was a prophet, but He was not the Christ, the Messiah, meaning that He is the Lord. He is the one that came to fulfill the prophecy of Moses, to come and become the King and the Messiah that God promised, that will liberate the people. Okay, so Jesus was downplayed by the religious leaders and the Jewish experts, especially in the law. According to this view, and His nature, His divine nature, was downplayed by these people. Therefore, John began to write in order to provide a perspective for his audience, so that they would understand that Jesus is not a pure man or a mere man, but Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Messiah, Jesus is King. Another view that is dominant and very important for us to understand as well is the view that states that John's intention is to write his gospel as a way of making an apology or a defense for the divine nature of Jesus Christ as God came to earth and dwelt among humanity. For instance, in John chapter 1, it says that Jesus came, verse 14 through the verse 18, Jesus came and dwelt, tabernacle, pitched His tent, pitched His house among us. Jesus the God, He came and lived among us. So one of the things that this view is proposing is that Jesus Christ is the God-man. He's both human and He is divine. The static union of Jesus Christ. Hypostatic union of Jesus Christ. It's a fancy, big theological word that's thrown around, but it's very important that Jesus is both man and God at the same time. Both man and God at the same time. How that works, some of us call it a mystery, but also John, according to these theologians, John was trying to promote this view. In other words, John was making an apologetic argument for Jesus' divine nature in the book of or the Gospel according to John. How did he develop that idea? He developed that idea using, instead the concept of miracle, he used the concept of signs. That miracles or signs are aware that they are pointing to Jesus' divine nature. They are pointing to Jesus as the God-man. In other words, there are 7 signs that John uses through this gospel in order to point us to Jesus' divine nature. So that's just a brief background for us to understand and to be able to not accurately, but to give a proper interpretation within the historical and social context of the Gospel of John. So let's review back that point. Number 1, he's arguing against the religious leaders. Number 2, he's making an apologetic argument for the divine nature of Jesus Christ. So with that being said, we are going to move now onto our text, and I want to invite you to grab your Bibles and let's read this powerful story together. 15 verses, and let's look at some things that we can learn from this story today as we see what the church should be right now in a time of crisis. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. When Jesus went up the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover feast, which is the feast of the Jews, was at hand. The Passover is a concept that they are remembering the hands of God delivering his people from the power of Pharaoh in Egypt. In other words, they were looking for a next Moses type kind of leader. They was not looking for a king, but they were looking for a political leader primarily. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread will not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. That means that if you were not seated, you did not get. So also the fish, as much as they wanted, and which they had eaten, they filled. He told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Then he said, this is the Messiah, this is the King, this is the Lord. He said, this is the prophet. Okay? Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word. So, what was this text teaching us about God as provider? And while we are answering this question as God as provider, okay, let's begin first analyzing this text within its context. In John chapter 5, we find a scenario where Jesus healed a man that was born blind. After he healed this man that was born blind, a lot of things started to occur in the society and at the time where this happened. And Jesus began to give a defense. He started to have a theological discussion with the religious leaders and the experts of the law. And as he was having this theological discussion with these people, Jesus began to make as premise that he is equal to God the Father. That was a scandalous concept that Jesus was proposing. A mere man saying that he is God the Father. No, in the mind of these religious leaders and experts, nobody was even at the level of Moses. No, to move past Moses to go to God the Father, that is an outrageous, hilarious statement according to these people's theological framework and perspective. And Jesus started to have this debate and this argument and this theological discussion with these people. And Jesus came to the conclusion that he is equal to the Father, that he does not do nothing or anything except what he sees the Father is doing. So if you take time to read chapter 5, you find all this situation going on. And then Jesus go over now to chapter 6 after finishing up this discussion with these religious leaders and experts of the law. He went now to chapter 6, and in chapter 6 he started to demonstrate that he's actually God in the flesh. And how did he do that? He did that by a sign that he performed in this chapter, in verse 1 until verse 15. From verse 1 until verse 15, he demonstrated that the argument that he was making in chapter 5 is true. So the people then, they will not be following simply a prophet, simply a person that preached or a miracle worker, but he wanted the people to see him as God, who provided in the Old Testament during what we call the unleavened bread period. The unleavened bread period, as we see in the Passover here in chapter 6, was the idea that God was providing for the people when he delivered them out of Egypt into now on their journey to the promised land. So the unleavened bread period is that God providing for them so that they will not go back to the old but to the new. In other words, that God was inviting them to leave behind the old and embrace the new journey that God was giving them. So that's the idea of the unleavened bread in conjunction to the Passover. Embrace the new thing that I'm bringing. Embrace the fact that we have a new journey that we are going to embark on. So the Passover was significant because they were saying we need a next deliverer like Moses, and they were looking to Jesus to be that political leader. But Jesus was pointing through these signs far beyond that political leader. He was pointing that he is God. So in chapter 5, we find in the chapters then before, we find that Jesus was showing that he has turned water into wine. He has healed the official's son that was ill. He has healed a man born blind. And now he's showing that he is the divine God, that even in a crisis that we have here, remember, being the church in time of crisis, there is a crisis because there was a shortage of food supply for the people. That what we are passing through here on San Andreas Island. We see blockades behind blockade yesterday and day before. People are asking for gas, people are asking for the propane gas, they're asking for water, they're asking for food. The government is trying to do what they can do and reach to the people with the routes that they have designed, and that causes exasperation among the population and the community. So they are asking for food. This is the same crisis that happened here. And in the midst of that crisis, Jesus showed up. And this is what this text is teaching us. We have a God in Jesus. We have the God in Jesus Christ. And we have our God in Jesus Christ, who is not hidden in times of crisis, but he's always present in times of crisis. That's very important because in Psalms 23, you know what David said? That even in times like this, he is with me. He is with me. In Psalm 46, he said that he is our present help in times of trouble. Let's put that word from trouble to crisis. He's our very present help in times of crisis. So this theme of Jesus as our provider, as God as our provider, run through the entire Bible. So we find it in the Old Testament, but we also find it in the New Testament. Paul said in Philippians chapter 4 that God shall supply our needs according to his riches in glory. So if God, that Paul is talking about, and Jesus demonstrating John chapter 6 that he's God that provides, that means that the argument is saying that Jesus is God. Scripture is pointing us to Jesus as God. So one of the things that we need to learn today is that Jesus is always present with us. So let me pause here parenthetically and say this. If you are lacking and you have a shortage of provision in your life, don't panic. Don't get full of fear and get desperate, because you have a God as long as you have accepted the sacrifice that Jesus has paid for you on that cross, and he rose again from the dead, and now he lives in you according to Romans 6:7, and he lives in us now, and that the spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, Romans 8:11, lives in us. Now you have a God that will supply all your need. So don't panic, don't get exasperated, because your God is not hidden, but he is your ever-present help in times of trouble. So we come to this portion of the text in the scripture, and we can learn a lot of things about our God as provider. But before we go there, we need to relate this story. So there's a shortage, there's a crisis. They didn't have money to pay for all the people that were following Jesus. In the text we find that these people were following Jesus not for who Jesus is, but for what Jesus was doing. And because of that, Jesus saw the need that these people had, and he went to Philip and said, Philip, boy, how can we provide for these people? How can we do something in order to provide for these people that are in need right now? And Philip said, boy, Jesus, we don't have the budget for this. We don't have the budget that can suffice and supply the need of all these people. So let's send them away. Okay? Jesus already knew what he was doing, but he, according to John, he did that to test Philip. He wanted to see if Philip had faith. Then we come now to Andrew. He said, Andrew come up now and said, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, and said, okay, you know, Andrew is very creative. Andrew said, okay, I saw a lad, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Maybe we can use that for something, don't you think? But I don't think that will supply all the need also. And so they went on. And Jesus started to give some instruction, and Jesus started to encourage the people. And that's what I want us to understand. That in times of crisis and in time of shortage, when we lack, and as a church to be the church in times of crisis, we need to be the voice of God, giving instruction to our people, not to get panic, not to become fearful, not to become wild and acting like crazy, but let's follow and trust in God as our provider and see God do out of what we don't have. He make much out of it so that he can supply all our needs. So when we come to this, Jesus did that. Jesus provided, and Jesus did a miracle, and everything happened, and the people, they started to get wild and started to celebrate. Hey, Jesus, you are the prophet as a whole, and things like that, and we are going to make you king. And Jesus withdrew from there. What we can learn about our God here? The first thing we can learn about our God is that God's provision is not contingent on our faithfulness. God's provision is not contingent on our faithfulness. Remember in verse 1, in verse 2, he said that, and a large crowd was following Jesus. Listen to this. Because they saw the signs that Jesus was doing on the sick. You notice that? I love Jesus. Jesus never provided. Jesus could have said, I'm not going to provide for you guys because you are not faithful. You are only following me because of what I can do and what I have done for the sick. Therefore, you want that for your life, so you are following me. You are not following me because I am God. You are not following me because you want to worship me as God. You are just only doing that because you saw the signs that I have provided. So listen to this. God's provision isn't contingent or dependent upon our faithfulness. Even people that are not faithful to the church or are not faithful to God, God will also provide for them. And that's a lesson for us as a church. That we should not only focus on providing for the faithful ones, but we should always find ways to provide for our people who are in need. Not for those that want, but for those that are in need. And this is what Jesus is showing us. In times of crisis, the church should be seeking ways to provide for those in need. Number 2, God's provision is not contingent on our budget. In other words, if your budget don't have sufficient funds to provide for the need of people, that is not a limitation for God to provide for people. Look at what the Bible said. The Bible said that when time Jesus lifted up his eyes then and looked at the people and the large crowd and saw the need of the people, he turned and he asked Philip, okay, what we are going to do? And Philip said, why are we to buy bread? Where are we to buy bread? In verse 5. And said, so that these people may eat. He said to test him, for he himself knew what he was to do. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread will not even supply that. We don't have the budget, Jesus. See, 200 denarii and 1 denarii equivalent of 1 day wage of work. That means that you will have to work a full day in order to get 1 denarii. So in other words, to get 200 denarii, you have to work 200 days out of 365. Make the calculation. You know what that means? That they never had enough money. And Philip looked at their budget and started saying, Jesus, we can't help because we don't have the budget. That's very important. It's a lesson for us to understand. Jesus is not limited by our budget. Our budget should not limit us as to the way we should help people. Our budget should actually causes us to trust God's provision. This is the lesson that God was trying to show Philip. Trust me, brother. Trust me. Trust me, and you shall see the supply and the resources come to pass. So God's provision is not contingent on our budget. It's not dependent on our budget. God's provision is not contingent on our faithfulness, our budget, nor either our help. Notice Andrew. Andrew thought that he would do something better than Philip. Started to brag. See, Jesus, I'm going to help. I saw over there creatively, I saw over there a boy had something that he worked with. According to various historians, especially Josephus said that that was a poor man bread. Poor man, a loaf of bread was a poor man meal. In other words, a poor person would walk with that bread or loaf of bread in order to suffice his or her hunger. So this young boy had a poor man lunch bags. And Jesus take out of the little what that person got and multiply so that everybody can have. And then not only everybody can have, but look what Jesus did. Jesus even saved up the leftover. Nothing should be wasted. So God does not need our help in order to provide for people. But God can take what we have in order to supply the need of people. He does not need our help, but He can take what we have as long as we make it available to Him to supply the need of people. And lastly, very important that we need to understand is this principle. God's provision is contingent on His grace. In other words, this story concludes with this beautiful lesson. It was the grace of God that provided for these people. It was not the ability or the faithfulness of these people. It was not the budget of these people. It was not the help of these people, but it was the grace of God upon these people. That's a very important picture that we need to capture and understand, because it was the grace of God that set you and I free. Jesus did not have to come. Jesus did not have to sacrifice Himself. Jesus did not have to go on that cross. Jesus did not have to allow people to mistreat Him. Jesus is God Himself, and He did not have to do that. But because the grace that was the grace that He demonstrated to us, no, according to the church historians and according to the church tradition, that by grace, no, we can have union with God through Jesus Christ. It was the grace of God that provides and supply our need. God don't have to provide for you. God does not have to supply for your need. God does not have to come through for you. But because He's a gracious and merciful God, He provides for you. And the greatest provision that God has provided for you and I is His Son, Jesus Christ. And He is the fullness of God's grace, according to Titus chapter 2, verse 10 and verse 11, according to John chapter 1, that He is the fullness of grace, that He is truth, full of truth and full of grace. Jesus is grace Himself. So God provided out of Himself for us and for these people. So out of who He is, He provides for us. So what we need to understand from this lesson today, we need to look at Jesus. In times of crisis at the church, we need to point people first to Jesus as God, and not only as the God who blesses. We can't only point people to God's hand and forsake the God whose hand we are holding. We need to provide for people indeed, but we need to point people to God. I like Jesus for that. He instructed the people, sit, he prayed, and he sought God and gave thanks, and then he started to distribute among the people. So as a church, let's seek God. Let's seek God and let God instruct us as to what we need to do creatively so that we can provide for people. A church in the United States, Austin, Texas, right now, paid $10 million for people who are going through a crisis that cannot pay their medical bills. And this church provided $10 million to pay off the medical bills of every person right now in the state of Austin, in the state of Texas, in Austin, the city of Austin, pay off the medical bill because they wanted to be Jesus for these people. As the alternative, we need to be Jesus for the people who are in need right now. How we do that? Let's ask God to give us ideas. It doesn't mean necessarily we need to give money all the time or food. Yes, that's important, but we need to give people Jesus. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for our time of study tonight. I pray that you bless us and you guide us. I pray that you continue to speak to us and continue to illustrate, my God, to us that you are our God who provides in times of crisis and in seasons of crisis. You never give up on us. You never relent. You are always providing. We bless you and we honor you. In Jesus' name I pray. So Alternative Family and Extended Family online on our YouTube channel. Please connect with us on our YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed so that you can get our pop-up message as to when we are live, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and also our page on Facebook, the Alternative Side. Like our page so you can get updates and you can get quotes and information. And also, as we are praying every night from 9 to 10 p.m. We want you to also shoot us your prayer requests and just let us know. Keep chatting with us and keep informing us as to what you learned from this lesson today. What is the lesson that you learned from us, from this story and this lesson about God being our provider through John chapter 6, verse 1 to verse 15. God bless you and we love you. Stay tuned and stay connected.
You've just watched a message from The Alternative Online, a ministry of the Alternative Family Church. God bless you, and we hope you join us again soon.